Hello, and welcome to the Self-Healing Revolution, where ancient wisdom and modern science meet. I am your host, Paige Pierman, owner of Love Yourself, an Ayurveda and integrative practice based in Louisville, Kentucky, where I do online health coaching and integrative and Ayurvedic health courses. My goal with this summit is to help introduce you to many guest speakers who cover a range of different topics in health and wellness. We will cover biohacking your body, mastering your mind, and elevating your soul. It took me over a decade to heal my own life after being diagnosed with fibromyalgia, leaky gut, chronic fatigue syndrome, and a host of many other issues. And I learned that it didn't take one and done approach. It took many approaches to healing and an integrative approach overall. So again, it's my goal with this summit that you will learn a lot of great knowledge from these speakers. And it is my honor today to welcome Christian Bates, who first became fascinated with health and wellness when he lost 50 excess pounds in 6 months by laying off of bread while exercising daily. He has since dedicated his life to the pursuit of holistic health, experimented with just about every diet and fitness trend, and made many mistakes while learning many lessons along the way. Now he chooses to be strong and flexible, eat ancestrally, build his lifestyle around daily habits that shield us from the health depleting booby traps of modernity, and see just how healthy a human can be when we give it the right inputs. Christian is the founder and formulator of longevitypower.com, an organic supplement company dedicated to serving the modern holistic wellness seeker who desires to maximize their potential every day with ancestral functional nutrition. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Paige. It's great to be here. This is going to be fun.
Yes, I'm so excited to explore the topic of ancestral eating and what that means to you and what that looks like. And I love that you said in your bio that you've tried many different diets and have found that this is the right one for you. I always tell my clients that I've experimented with my own body, and it's only through that experimentation that I have found what's worked best for me. So I love that you have created this journey and learned from it and have knowledge to share with anyone who's listening today.
Yeah, I've definitely embodied the kind of what I would consider almost universal, where we try something new and it works really great at first, and then over time it doesn't work so well, and so we have to either sometimes just tweak it or sometimes dramatically change it. And that's happened to me over and over again. But now that I've eaten more animal-based for the last 10 years, although I'm still always tweaking things to work on what works for me individually, and I believe that everyone is an individual with, very unique immune system issues and brain function. And so there's no one size fits all. But I've definitely learned a lot along the way.
Yes, I agree. I have as well. I've gone from ketogenic to vegan to vegetarian to pescatarian to eating Mediterranean, eating more pagan.
I did that in the reverse order, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if it's in the order that I did it, but eating a pagan diet, which is like, paleo vegan, and like you, I found what really works for my body type. And also, as you know, I'm an Ayurvedic practitioner. So I also realized that there's not a one size fits all approach. And everybody is, we have ectomorph, mesomorph, endomorph. And, if you look at traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda, some people are more warm, have warm body types, some people cold. And so, but I definitely am so interested to learn from you today and explore this topic of ancestral eating and what does that look like for you?
These days, it is a lot of beef, but not just lean beef cuts. It would be fatty beef cuts, ground beef, beef organs, a lot of liver, beef fat. I really love tallow. I'm a bit sensitive to dairy because of the casein content, even when I have A2 milk or A2 dairy products. I'm still sensitive to casein. I would love to biohack my way back to dairy somehow, because I do think dairy is extremely nutritious and such a versatile ingredient for making delicious foods.
Mhm.
But at this point, instead of butter, I do a lot of tallow. And bone broth, I do a lot of like organ powders, bone broth protein, and then I will do a very select amount of plant foods, which is mostly going to be herbs and vegetables that have a lower amount of anti-nutrients. So I've been doing a lot of squash lately. I used to do a lot of like cruciferous vegetables and onions and foods that are kind of high in oxalates. But I found that I need to take a break from those because I did start to feel a little bit off after, say, having a bunch of cauliflower, like whipped cauliflower concoctions. Um, so that's what's working for me these days.
Yeah, it's interesting. In terms of the dairy, I'm just curious, have you really looked in staying like away from cows, the form like more goat's milk and like goat cheese products? Have you explored that?
Fully.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much my sensitivity has to do with like genetics that I just can't get away from,
Mhm.
or something that I need to work on in myself, uh, or some combination of both. I do feel that eventually one day, it might take another 10 years, I'll be like devouring dairy. I mean, it seems kind of inevitable given the last 20 years of where I will, like, say, when I first began, when I
Mhm.
first lost that 50 excess pounds, I was a teenager. And this was 2002. So this was before we could easily search and go on forums and look at a lot of people's personal accounts. At the time, I just kind of had to take an author's word for it on
Mhm.
what worked for them. And so I ended up in an echo chamber of veganism, specifically raw veganism back then.
Yeah.
And I thought that because I wasn't a junk food vegan, I was eating the most organic, most nutrient dense, but still within the confines of being raw and vegan. I thought that I found, the panacea. I thought I found like, I started to believe things that now I think are uh, obviously false. And that would be like that humans are these fruitarian frugivores and that eating meat was a mistake. I believed that for many years. But over time, I slowly figured out that, oh, all these hunter-gatherer societies have always eaten an omnivorous meat-based diet, and that everyone who is vegan long term either stops being vegan or starts to have neurological issues.
Yeah. I want to really explore that with you, the neurological issues. I want to ask you a few questions. I just want to backtrack to when you went plant-based and more vegan and raw,
I
what were
felt
your
amazing at first.
right? And what were your and I've heard that from many people, especially like, we've connected through my partner Chris, who grew up in this vegan plant-based community, just as I think you did. Maybe that's how you met in
Yeah,
Arizona.
yeah, that's how we met at a raw vegan festival.
Yeah, and so I want to explore what were your belief systems at that time, and then how did you debunk those belief systems? So at that time, like you felt good in the beginning, and it was serving you well to a point. So what were the belief systems that you had? Why was that the approach you were taking? I just want to explore that more because a few reasons. I want to see what you say, and then I have some thoughts around that I'd like to share.
Well, I was eating raw vegan for about 8 years, and halfway through that, I started to develop skin issues
Mhm.
and became very sensitive to my staple sweetener, agave nectar. And I had even launched a meal replacement raw cacao superfood bar that, in terms of being a raw vegan superfood bar, was like the best of the best at the time.
Yeah.
It was sweetened with agave, and I eventually couldn't even eat my own product. And once I stopped doing agave, I started to be sensitive to like the next most sugary thing that I was eating. So other syrupy sweeteners, dried fruit,
Mhm.
and slowly got lower and lower carb in my diet until I was eating there's a doctor named Gabriel Cousens
Mhm.
who at the time I thought was eating like the best of the raw vegan diet because he actually had a lot of clinical studies showing that compared to a like really high fruit sugar vegan diet, compared to a low carb, low glycemic vegan diet, people's blood work was really good, looking really good. They were getting off insulin. So I thought, okay, now I'm eating the best raw vegan diet. But then I started to still have skin issues. And I eventually figured out that it had so much to do with seed oils. Even though the seed oils I was consuming were cold pressed, organic, raw, high quality as they can be, I eventually figured out that they were about the same as processed industrial seed oils like corn oil, safflower oil, soybean oil, canola oil, all those processed seed oils that I used to think were terrible because they were processed. But now I understand that it's mainly the fatty acid distribution of those oils. They're so high in the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid, linoleic acid. And I think that I probably did damage possibly to my pancreas in the long term on a vegan diet, probably mainly because most of my fats were seed oil based rather than the more animal fat, high saturated fat, high monounsaturated fats that I consume these days. And so what coincided with how I felt in my body was also me like questioning everything and figuring out, okay, I was in an echo chamber. Now I need to look wider. And that eventually got me into non-vegan products. So I slowly dabbled in like eggs and then certain cooked foods. Some didn't work for me. Like I was getting really sensitive to my favorite, like dense protein, fat rich, raw vegan food, which was sprouted sunflower seeds blended into like a really good pate. But I started to get sensitive to that. And that's because sunflower oil, which sunflower seeds are half oil, is seed oil.
Yeah,
and so I was like,
you're too far in that direction.
yeah. And so I kept trying to find alternatives, and that eventually led me to more animal products. Eventually, dairy powders that I experimented with, mainly colostrum at the time, still had a little dairy sensitivity, and then found my way to the bone broth proteins, actual meat and organs, and replaced my favorite recipes with the meat version.
Interesting. So I wanted to go back to what you mentioned about the nervous system and why that's important when you were speaking about the nervous system and how you believed that the plant vegan based diet was not benefiting your nervous system. Why did you begin to believe that? And why was that starting to come as information coming forward that you needed to look at?
I'm not sure, like if I was vegan longer, I imagine my nervous system would be wrecked by now. I think that I was one of the lucky ones who somehow my neurology, my myelin sheaths, whatever quality of my body had, was able to kind of push off the negative effects of the seed oils for long enough that I didn't get particularly neurotic. Because I have seen people where you can see that their brain function changes. I've met long-term raw vegans who they can't even look you in the eye. And I want so much for these people. I still have a lot of raw vegan friends. I tell them it would be my honor if you would try, my, I don't know, bone broth protein, something that would be more ethically compliant for them, because bone broth is technically like a byproduct. Or oysters, which don't have a nervous system, so they're more like a plant. And I think that the seed oils, they just lack, as well as there's so many things lacking in a raw vegan diet. There's all these fat soluble vitamins, vitamin A, D, E, lack of B vitamins. All of these things nourish our nervous system and our brain. And if we don't have that, and we're instead bombarding ourselves with linoleic acid, which causes metabolic disruption, that's eventually going to eat away at the health of someone's nerves and vitality.
Yeah, I want to speak from the Ayurvedic perspective around it, because I think there's a myth that people believe because of the yoga community that Ayurveda or even yoga is is vegan. And that is far from the truth, because in Ayurvedic medicine, one of the biggest carriers for the herbs is ghee, being clarified butter, which again has that high content of vitamin A, E, D, K. And so not only is it ghee used, a clarified butter used as a carrier for the herbs, but it's also a big part of cleansing the body and nourishing the body. And there's a myth that when people get into Ayurveda, they believe that it's plant-based or that it's vegetarian or vegan, when in fact, over 5,000 years ago, they were using bone broth to heal and seal the gut lining, as well as they were using for people who had nervous system disorders and deeper nervous system problems, they were using bone broth enemas to help for what was considered a vata vitiation. And so speaking to what you're saying, the ancient wisdom there is, I think sometimes because of the yoga concept of ahimsa, which is to do no harm, that there was also this thought that animal products were not used. And there was a concept to do no harm, but I think it's been taken too far in the American Western mindset, because animal products, and especially bone broth, were used medicinally, especially when what you were talking about, which is any nervous system disorder or mood disorder or brain disorder, precisely because what's called the Maja Dhatu, the nervous system, is a deeper tissue in the body, and you need, like you said, you can't get necessarily those B vitamins converted, or K2 cannot be converted from plant-based products. It has to come from either cow's milk or ghee, or from the cow itself. And so I'm glad that you brought up what you've seen as a long-term trend of when you take something out of the diet for a long period of time, how it can affect the deeper tissues in the body, which from an Ayurvedic perspective, those two systems would be the Maja Dhatu, which is the nervous system, as well as the bone, the Ashti Dhatu, and then the third area that would be the Shukra Dhatu, which is the reproductive system of the body. So if it was taken to an extreme for a really, really long time, then even the reproductive system and the hormones would be wildly disrupted. And I think that people don't really know that. So it's interesting that you kind of came to this conclusion as you witnessed what was happening within your own body.
Yeah, it took me a while to realize that, simply because I either wasn't exposed to it because I was staying in a certain echo chamber, or I wasn't ready to hear it and I subconsciously pushed it away. But nowadays, I totally agree with all of that. And I do wonder, like, in the history of certain societies where maybe having the accessibility of a wide variety of meat and organs may have been reduced because of population density and other social things. So therefore, milk and a limited amount of animal products would have been the main staples. And I think that has so much to do with the history of Ayurveda. And so, like, and I mean, maybe not, maybe it's much more complex of a history than that. But like, if you don't have access to, say, liver all the time, but you do have access to dairy products, then you definitely want to find, and you don't just want like sugary milk all the time. You definitely want butter or ghee or even cream. And then ghee being the most shelf stable, that would also be a huge reason. Like, okay, if we're going to figure out how to serve the masses the best, and we can't expect everyone to be a hunter who gets organ meats and tallow and stuff all the time, we definitely want them to have these staples, which would be like ghee, maybe bone broth, things like that.
Yeah, just like you were speaking about, well, I mean, I don't know your take on this, but a big part of Ayurveda, again, when there's an issue with the nervous system, is actually to use quality fats. And that like a superfood in Ayurveda is ghee, because it is clarified butter. So if you do have intolerance to dairy products, most likely you won't with ghee, especially if it's clarified the right way. So yeah, I mean,
by the way, I did used to have like a cup of ghee a day that I would make myself. And I eventually started to feel like I had dairy after I had it. So I'm still on a ghee break.
Mhm.
I should definitely experiment with ghee again.
Right.
And I don't know why that is, because there should be like 0 casein left, but it's possible that the, I don't know, vibration of casein where my body's still recognizing it in an autoimmune fashion could be in there.
Well, I would advise you maybe in the future, if you wanted to talk to me further, is exploring ghee was not used. It was used with spices, the right proper ones to help with your agni, your digestive fire. So by itself, without the carriers, to help with agni or the digestive fire, a big part of Ayurveda is not like ghee in a silo. It's used properly with the digestive herbs that are right for your body type or what you're experiencing. So maybe as you explore, if you were to introduce it back in, maybe get really clear on what kind of digestive herbs would be good carriers for you. And I think that's where, a lot of Ayurveda has some beauty in the science of what digestive power looks like within the body. There's 3 different types. There's Tikshnagni when the fire is too strong, and then there's Vikshmagni where the fire is low and it's high, and then Mandagni when the fire is suppressed. And so Ayurveda was really wise in the way that herbs were used to support the digestive fire in the gut. But without going to that, I just want to explore more with you the ancestral diet. And so when did you look at the history, or were you looking at like ancestral wisdom, or were you just like, I'm really just going to experiment within my own body?
I was introduced to the concept of rewilding,
Mhm.
where basically ever since agriculture was created several
Mhm.
thousand years ago, we have been eating a diet that is based on a system that we may not have fully evolved into, because agriculture evolved faster than perhaps our bodies could. And that could be demonstrated from, just the dental problems people had thousands of years ago. How much that has to do with, oh, they were eating domesticated cows versus wild uh, ruminant animals. Probably that's not it. It's mostly that people were eating a lot of grain, maybe even a lot of beer, uh, and a lot of just having their calories come more from plants and their nutrients coming more from plants. And so therefore there's going to be fewer of those fat soluble vitamins, fewer of certain essential amino acids and fatty acids, more anti-nutrients, inflammatory compounds. And so that could just dramatically and epigenetically, meaning over a couple generations, cause someone's genetic or dental expression to become skewed a lot. And so I thought, oh, okay, how do I slowly get more into wild foods? I want to eventually subsist on like all wild foods. These days, I'm not really pursuing that as much. I love beef, grass-fed, preferably grass-fed and finished beef. I feel that that is almost identical to, say, wild deer venison. That I'm really happy right now in terms of like kind of eating a wild mimicked diet. And also for a while, my main fat was wild boar lard, which you can actually order. And it's pretty much the only legal way you can order a wild game meat is by ordering from Texas wild boar fat cuts. And so I'd render that myself all the time. And I thought, okay, I'm getting most of my calories now, since fat is over twice as dense in calories than protein and carbs. So I'm getting pretty much all my calories from a wild food. And I just love wild boar lard. However, I do think that wild boar lard, even if it's wild, even if those boars are not eating, say, a lot of agricultural products, they're not in the grain fields, the corn fields, the fatty acid distribution in a single stomached animal is still going to have just a little bit more linoleic acid, that omega-6 inflammatory fatty acid that we need a little bit of, but not too much, is going to be higher in single stomached animals like pig and chicken than the ruminant animals, all the red meat animals. So these days I've switched to tallow, and I've also found that tallow is more shelf stable and just has a smoother flavor long term, whereas wild boar lard can start to have a little oxidized flavor faster.
So I wanted to ask you a question. There's when I started looking at dental health and studying it in Ayurveda, I came across Dr. Stephen Lin, who has a book called The Dental Diet. And I was looking at the ancestral shifts of the jawline over, the last, since people switched over to agriculture. So they looked at more indigenous tribes and the diets that they were eating. And interestingly enough, like their jaws were wider, their cheeks were wider, their noses were wider, and they didn't have the crowding of the teeth that we see now in our modern day diet, because exactly what you were saying, which they were getting these fat soluble vitamins within their diet. And they could show just a shift within like one generation of how much the jawline and the dental issues began within the diet. So it definitely was this aha moment for me in realizing the importance of, getting, good quality animal-based protein. And I'm just curious too, like, as you've gone in this journey, you haven't said much about like fish within your diet and like omega-3s. I'm curious, do you eat a lot of fish, or is that something that you have incorporated? And if so, like, what is your approach when it comes to eating fish or pescatarian, or eating, adding that to your diet? Because a lot of our ancestors were fishermen. I'm just curious where that falls within your protocol.
For the last few years, I was eating a lot of fish up until maybe 3 years ago, when someone said, hey, there might be more microplastics in fish and seafood than we thought. And I usually feel better eating, like I feel like more fully energized when I have red meat versus fish. And so that, combined with being concerned about microplastics and mercury, I still eat some seafood. I think that there's probably not quite enough long chain omega-3 DHA EPA in, say, beef fat. I mean, there is some, but maybe not quite enough that to be optimal. So I still have some, but I'm still figuring that out. I would eat more fish if I thought it was microplastic free, but at this point, I just am being more cautious about it.
Yeah, I can say I run my lab work regularly to see, where things might be lacking, so I can increase whatever I need to increase within my own diet. And I actually eat fish, once or twice a week. And even with that, my DHE levels were lower than optimal. And so I was just curious, because that's one thing that I've been exploring myself, is like, am I getting enough fish protein, and am I getting enough, obviously you can supplement with it, and there are like Nordic omega, they're fish oils that you can get that are cleaner if you get them from the north versus the more polluted fish that are deeper in the sea.
I've also done a lot of fish oil, but I am also concerned about the oxidation of those, not while they're in the bottle. Like they could be the freshest ever, but if you're having a concentrated amount of these long chain omega-3s, which, just like the omega-6s, are more oxidizable, more unstable, break down into free radicals. I'm also concerned about that. I don't know. Like, I would have more omega-3s just to like make sure I get that brain boosting feeling. But there's a lot of schools of thought that think actually that's more detrimental, because even if it's super fresh when you have it, after being in your warm body several hours, even if you combine it with antioxidant compounds, there's still going to be a certain negative effect, especially in higher concentrations. So I really don't know. I would say if someone hasn't had, like, if someone's been a vegan for a long time, they should probably have a good amount of marine fats for a certain period of time. But it's possible that we can get most of them from say, ruminant fats, but I don't know yet.
Yeah. And then also I have a question. So kind of to that conversation, have you looked at like the blue zones or looked at the people that have the largest number of centennials? And I only mention that because when I studied the blue zones, I mean, like you, I'm always exploring. I'm not sold on one thing. I always look what's working the best for the individual. But in the blue zones, they talk about they used meat as supplemental. So it kind of goes back to, that Mediterranean diet. Have you considered that or explored that in your thinking, or you just, again, are going with, this is what's really working really well for me right now?
Well, I've always mainly gone with what works for me now, what makes me feel good, what gives me side effects that I
Mhm.
would need to take a break from.
Mhm.
That's always been like the main factor that drives the evolution of my diet. And then the theory just kind of backs that up. Uh, when I was vegan, I would read analysis of blue zone diets, and they would say, "Oh, this works because of all the plant-based stuff they have." Now that I'm eating more ancestrally, I'm finding articles online that are like, actually, all these blue zone diets have a huge variety of animal products. That's why they're so great. So I think it really depends on a deeper analysis of the blue zone
Mhm.
uh, diets. So I think there's just so much to think through that there's not like one conclusion you could have from that. I think it's going to be a constant exploration.
And I also believe this is just my own, as I've studied like you, I mean, I've looked at it all and I've tried to, again, help my clients, but I also believe that we are up against so many 80,000 man-made toxins and modern day farming practices and soil that has just been so
Yeah,
depleted because
unleashed wholesale
don't have
across the world.
biodynamic farming. So you have, in the United States, over 100 years of modern farming practices, there's no nutrients left in the soil anymore. And there's chemicals in our air, chemicals in our water, chemicals in our food. And so we're just dealing with a true onslaught all around, and that's what we're contending with. So it's hard to sometimes look precisely at what was working in the past because 500 years ago, they just weren't being exposed. Their immune systems weren't dealing with what we're up against right now.
Right. Um, and back in my plant-based days, I used that toxicity throughout the ecosystem as a reason to eat lower on the food chain.
Mhm.
But now I actually um, feel that having a biologically appropriate diet that's more meat-based, animal-based, is what's going to allow your body to more easily, readily detoxify and fend off these toxins.
So how, so I mean, like, how has that shifted your gut health? How has that shifted your energy? How has that shifted your mood? Just all these different areas, like what have you seen happen?
Well, my biggest challenge over the years has been figuring out what carbohydrates to eat. When someone has a lot of seed oils, that eventually can cause metabolic dysfunction that could lead to prediabetes or diabetes.
Mhm.
It basically causes your fat cells to become kind of like they want the fat, and then your ability to produce the perfect amount of insulin to balance your blood sugar gets disrupted. And so that's how someone ends up in a very compromised situation. I think mainly from the seed oils, but also, excess sugar. Although these days, I think that if you get your metabolism on point, that you should be able to be very fit in your diet and be able to have a bunch of sugary fruit one day with very little fat, or be able to be keto another day and feel amazing. And so I'm trying to have that fitness, but I'm still a little bit sensitive to carbs. I would eat more carbs if I could. Like I would eat 100, 200, 300 grams a day. But because I was keto for so long and also got into the keto echo chamber. So by the way, the keto and even the super low carb carnivore space that is often in the echo chamber where people will deny that when you don't stimulate your insulin for a long period of time, or you stimulate it insufficiently with an insufficient amount of carbs, that will eventually raise your SHBG, or sex hormone binding globulin amount, which
Repeat that part. So what are they saying increases your sex hormone globulin account? Which
not stimulating insulin enough.
so not stimulating insulin enough. So on a ketogenic, are you saying on a ketogenic diet? I just want to clarify.
On a very strict ketogenic diet. By the way, most ketogenic diets are not strict enough to do this. So if you're eating a
strict one,
yeah, like if you're like your average keto cookbook is probably going to have enough almonds and kind of carb rich plant foods that are more like not really super keto, but just low carb. So a lot of people don't run into this problem unless they go super hardcore, which I certainly did. And so my SHBG levels rose because I wasn't stimulating insulin regularly enough.
Interesting.
And so therefore, even though I had high total testosterone, the high SHBG makes your free testosterone much lower, which is more important than your total testosterone. And
more important
because your free testosterone is actually going to go to it's going to plug into the receptor sites and do its thing. Whereas if most of your total testosterone is not free, but is bound up by sex hormone binding globulin, then that testosterone is kind of neutralized. And so it imbalances your hormones, and that can cause a lot of issues.
So definitely for men.
Definitely for men. And then sex hormone binding globulin combined, and by the way, insulin does have all these other benefits too. So for women, equally as much with other hormones, having excess SHBG can also have long-term problems. And so if you are carb sensitive, or you're really into the benefits of keto, I would suggest figuring out how to be cyclically keto, such that you're able to have certain carb feasts in a way that works for you, that does not wreck your immune system, where you get back into ketosis when you're fasting, so that by the next morning, you're in a real stable state and your blood sugar is not going up and down.
I caution women more than men on a ketogenic diet for multiple reasons, because we're based on a 28.3 day cycle, and women need different amounts of carbs at different times within that cycle. So as a woman ends her cycle, she can eat or fast more. But once she gets to ovulation, that 14-day mark, it's important that she get the proper carbohydrates for her estrogen and progesterone levels. And I've experimented a lot with myself, and just like you, I've played around a lot, and I can say with good friends who are females, that I caution women, they can really wreak havoc on their hormones if they're not doing that properly. So like you're saying, cycling through is important when you're doing fasting, or you're eating more high fat and lowering your carbohydrate intake. It's just different for women than it is for men.
Yeah, I would agree. A lack of carbohydrates, like in the beginning, when let's say someone's having an excess amount of carbohydrates most of their life, and it's stressing their body out, when they first take a break, it can feel, sometimes it can be uncomfortable at first, but then it feels really good. But then in the long term, a lack of carbohydrates, a lack of just having a balanced, we're omnivores, we're supposed to have some degree of all these different plants and mushrooms. A lack of that is going to stress us out. And usually it shows up in our blood work.
Yeah, I see a huge side effect with cortisol levels rising in women who have lower body weight. Cortisol levels rise at night, causing insomnia and causing just more side effect symptoms to premenstrual and menstrual symptoms in women, and especially with the cortisol levels increasing to high and disrupting sleep. So anyway, not to go down that rabbit hole with you, but so yeah, so you've experimented with this, and then it looks like now you've actually created a line. Like, what's happening, you know, in your own business? Like, how have you translated this for people to have more of an ancestral nutrient diet?
Well, 10 years ago, when I was in kind of a short period of time, about a year, where I went from pretty hardcore raw vegan to unleash the liver, unleash the bone broth, unleash all the beef, um, I had launched my business, Longevity Power, which is now 10 years old. And Longevity Power makes ancestral nutrition products for the modern holistic wellness seeker who really wants to thrive and have more convenient access to nutrients that are sometimes hard to come by. And so when I first launched it, I really wanted to focus on the world of adaptogens and functional mushrooms. So this would be things like cordyceps mushroom, which is like the athletic mushroom that gives you long burning energy without a crash. And that's because there are certain compounds that are related to ATP, which is part of your cellular energy. So unlike a stimulant, it's actually giving you like a nourishing amount of energy. And adaptogens, by the way, help you adapt to stress. They have a normalizing effect on your cellular function so that you can kick butt even amidst stressors, whether that stress is like a good stress or a eustress like exercise, or whether it is a kind of a, you know, quote unquote bad stress like driving all day, working long hours, or even you know, toxicity and imbalance. And there's a whole bunch of adaptogens that I found at the time were hard to come by in quality, or if they were quality, they were in capsules and were really expensive and kind of underdosed. And so I wanted to make a line of drink instant powders that someone could just add to their shake or make a quick elixir every day and get a really strong amount of these adaptogens in a comprehensive way. And so that's what Longevity Power has been for the most of the last few years. But I'm about to launch, I think I'll have launched it by the time this comes out at longevitypower.com, an ancestral line that allows someone to get all the major nutrients from an animal-based perspective without having to special order and go to your butcher and figure out, okay, how do I eat this fresh, slimy liver? I love eating fresh liver. I love blending it up. But when I first had liver, I had to hold my nose every single time. Like I was like, I knew this is good for me. I knew that liver has such a rich amount of B vitamins that if you have a bunch of it, it'll actually make your pee a bright color, just like when you have a lot of a B vitamin supplement. And it has like retinol, which is the preformed vitamin A. It has just choline, all these brain boosting substances. Liver is kind of the top organ, and then all the other organs like kidney, heart, thymus, brain, all these other things are really great too, but liver's like the top. And I found that even amongst my friends who are really into eating more ancestrally, that were just totally committed to doing whatever it takes to be healthy every day, they were still a bit squeamish and apprehensive about adding organs in. And so I wanted to make it like really convenient, not just for them, but also for myself, because I can get liver pretty easily. Just like my local natural food store always has grass-fed liver in the frozen section. But in order for me to say get a thymus gland, which is the gland in the chest that is really good for your immune system, I'm going to have to constantly be special ordering that. And even the local like regenerative grass-fed beef farms are it's just hard to get that, because on a local level they're very limited in the amounts that you can get. So I wanted to make it super convenient and also tasty. So this stuff tastes like a nutty powder, like a good protein powder, rather than a really strong organ product. So that's what I'm launching now.
So does it come in, it comes as a protein powder?
Yeah, I really want to, most organ powders, right, or organ supplements, pretty much all of them now are in capsules. But because the organ is a whole dried, freeze-dried, usually desiccated organ. Desiccated just means ground down. The dosage is like over 6 large horse pills a day. And
Yeah.
which is, that can be great, but you're not even tasting it. So there's a certain amount of disconnect. So I want people to actually have something that they can just scoop on, that they're directly tasting, that it's passing through their salivary enzymes, so that it's just also more affordable to have. There's less cost in producing a powder than a capsule, so that people can have the most possible best bang for their buck.
Have you, I'm just curious, and this could be like totally off base, but have you blended some of the adaptogens with the organ meats
Yes.
so that you can
Yep.
get both in the protein powder, or is that how you're doing it?
Yeah, one of them is going to be basically an ancestral feast of organs, and then some of the top adaptogens. So some of the top functional mushrooms. I haven't finalized that formula yet, but I will be in the next week. Might put my epic maca in it, which is not just raw milled maca, but it is a double extracted black sun-dried maca. So sun-dried maca has all the adaptogenic compounds. Maca that hasn't been sun-dried is basically like eating a radish. It doesn't really have adaptogenic effects.
So I'm assuming, oh, sorry to interrupt. I'm assuming that the adaptogens is what's giving it the nutty flavor.
It's both. It's actually when you freeze dry something, it tends to make it taste a little bit more like a bland protein rather than like a strong soupy organy flavor. So it's both. It's what I'm mixing with it, and also just the quality of the dehydration process that creates a more mild flavor. And I do think that organ meats, not just organs, but also connective tissue, so the bone broth, proteins, all the full spectrum of amino acids that your body needs, and adaptogens are like the two modern missing food groups.
Exactly.
Like most people are into quality meats, might be mostly just having lean cuts of muscle, but not having the fats, not having the organs, not having the connective tissue. And then most people who are into plant nutrition might be having certain nutraceuticals, but skipping the functional mushrooms and adaptogens. And I do think that when you combine the organs and the adaptogens, I mean, you're just going for feeling really good, having more performance, more energy throughout the day, building your health, building your nervous system, your resiliency to stress.
Yeah, I love that you brought up connective tissue, because as people age, I think that's one of the major side effects of aging, is that they have a lot of connective tissue issues, joint problems and mobility issues, and they have a lot of inflammation and just feeling all like the tin can man, if you will, just like really not being smooth and being able to have that mobility the way you do in your 20s.
Yeah. And I think that it's because humans evolved eating nose to tail, meaning whenever we would hunt an animal, we would, out of necessity, need to eat that whole animal. We couldn't just eat the lean meat and discard the rest. Like calorically, we would often not be able to hunt enough. We would really need, and also I think that once you have develop a taste for these other parts of the animal, you start to prefer it even more than the lean cuts. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'll still eat a ribeye or the really tasty, more conventional cuts of an animal, but I will crave the organs if I go like a day without them. And so I think that by over the generations of constantly having connective tissue nutrients and all these different nutrients, we become dependent on those nutrients. We can't manufacture them as well ourselves. And so therefore we need them just as what our biology needs.
I love that you said the nose to tail, because our ancestors, like, they used the whole animal, and now it's like it's so wasteful when we just it's like there's a lack of reverence for the animal when we don't use the whole animal. It's like wasting its life force energy. I just have like a consciousness around that, myself personally. But yeah, well, yeah, I'm so excited that you shared this knowledge and your experience and your own healing. I have one last question before we end. And you were talking about not only just the organ meats, but you moved more to fruits like squashes and away from other plants. Will you talk about that before we end today? I'm just curious to have you speak upon why you've eliminated the cruciferous vegetables, moved towards more towards fruits like squashes, and why that is.
Yeah, like if someone made me a salad that had cruciferous vegetables and the salad dressing did not have seed oils but had quality ingredients that I would eat, I would totally eat it. I just don't make these on the regularity for myself as I used to. Mm-hmm. And I coming from the plant-based world, I used to think that vegetables had all these nutrients, and they do, but they're not necessarily as bioavailable as those nutrients that would exist in an animal product. They're bound up, or they're in a form that our body would be inefficient at creating the final form that we need. And the plants, basically every part of the plant except for the fruit, although there are a lot of fruits with toxins and anti-nutrients or medicines, but most of the time the plant is it has its own chemical warfare that says, hey, don't overpredate me or you'll be sorry. And so leaves, barks, roots, all these different parts of a plant usually have some, like one or multiple, what we call anti-nutrients. And if we have these all the time, it can create a negative effect in our body. It can inhibit our thyroid in the case of cruciferous vegetables. It can cause a skin sensitivity, gut permeability issues. And so I'm just being as cautious as I can be about that, so that I can heal any damage that I did in the long term, which I'm sure I did in my plant-based days. I really need to just soothe my body as much as possible. And as much as I love stir-fried onions and steamed cauliflower, I just have to take a break from those and go with fruits. But I don't do like super sugary fruits all the time. So these days I've been doing a lot of pumpkin powder and zucchini and other squashes, especially for savory meals. And I still consume like dozens and dozens of plants and mushrooms every day, but those are adaptogens, which have very few anti-nutrients and are mostly full of functional nutrients. And that way I'm just as deliberate as I can be, so that every bite I take throughout the day, has deliberate intentions.
Yeah, it's interesting. In Ayurveda, it's Dr. John Diard. He's an Ayurvedic practitioner who talks about the 3 seasons diet. And that was early on in my Ayurvedic journey, but it really resonated with me. And then the more I studied Ayurveda, he talks about we never ancestrally ate the same way year round. Like there was the spring was different than the summer harvest was different than the fall harvest, and then the winter looked totally different. And I think people oftentimes will eat one thing year round, even though it's no longer in season. And he talks a lot about our microbiome needs specific nutrients and specific plants at different times. And that just happens to be like when they're in season or when they're in the right time of year. But then as I began to study Ayurveda, when we looked at herbs and we looked at, food as medicine, not one food group would be used more than 6 to 12 weeks. Because after that time, like you said, the body would reach a point of having its capacity to tolerate it. Like you said, at that point, it can become toxic because you reach a point at which you no longer need that nutritionally. And then that's when there's a defense mechanism, even within our own bodies, because we've evolved with nature, right? For thousands of years, there's that coevolution of plants and animals with our own genetics. And so I always caution people, like when they take herbs or they take food, that that they cycle through or use different plants or use different herbs, that nothing is meant to be taken indefinitely. With that being a caveat, rejuvenative herbs, or what's considered rasayanas, can be taken long term, and that includes, many of the adaptogens that you're speaking of. In that case, there's certain things that we can use indefinitely without a side effect. So I find it interesting that that's how you've found this within your own diet, your own nutrition, your own lifestyle.
And
So,
I should really add that I think that there's so much more to know about this. I think that there are a lot of foods that have anti-nutrients that I'm currently taking a break from that I probably will want to add back in because of their benefits on the microbiome, because of some hormetic effect, where even like when we're like, if I go to the gym and exercise and weight train and just tear down my muscles, if I were to immediately look at my blood work after that, it would have all these inflammatory compounds. And so we would think, oh, I'm not supposed to exercise. But then the next day or the next few days, there's a cascade of all these beneficial compounds. So I do think that there are a lot of foods, which could include like fermented sourdough grain, that I think that should work for some people, at least cyclically. I don't think that everyone should avoid that. I think that that would be very dogmatic and orthorexic of me to say that. Orthorexic is where you become so restrictive in a way that might work at first, but then eventually it causes health detriments.
Yeah, just like you said, the raw vegan, it worked really well in the short term, but in the long term, it had detrimental effects.
I mean, I don't think it really worked well in the short term either. I just think comparatively, going from a more standard American diet, I personally felt better, which might have had a psychosomatic, definitely had a psychosomatic component.
Well, I think initially, like you said, I mean, it definitely has an effect on taking inflammation down in the body, getting off those processed sugars, obviously removing, like you said, there was a lot of seed oils involved in that diet, but yeah, I like that you used the word cyclical. And again, just like referencing, I've really enjoyed Dr. John Diard's work over the years. He cautions against us limiting our diet to a few things, because again, our microbiome lacks that diversity. And so that's why, over the years, I really like looking at the circadian rhythm and looking at the cyclical nature of nature itself, realizing that food is medicine in the right time, in the right place for the right person. And again, like we can overutilize, one plant or one thing for too long. And yeah, so everything has a cyclical nature, and it's important to increase that biodiversity. And like you said, there is a time and a place for inflammatory markers. Like, I mean, at first, fasting might look like insulin levels may decrease, but if you fast for a long period of time, there's autophagy. So everything in the right place at the right time for the right person. Well, I just love what you shared, and I definitely think people will benefit from looking at your site and introducing adaptogens and organ meat and the protein form into their diet. So thank you so much. And you've offered, as part of the summit, a discount. And so if people go to your website and order from a promotional code, they can use Love Yourself, LUV yourself. So not LOVE, but LUV yourself in a promotional code. And that gives them a discount of how much?
20% off their first order.
Right. That's a huge discount. So I appreciate you joining me on the summit and also offering that promotional discount to the listeners.
Thanks so much, Paige. It's been a joy.
It has been a joy. Thank you.